Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you.
This is Fountainhead Forum 95. I have Johan Norberg, who is an author and a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He is also from Sweden, and we're going to talk about Sweden's actions, starting in 2020 when they were, told about this virus that was going to kill everybody and how they acted and how that worked out for them. How are you, Johan?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. One thing I always like to start out with, though, is how did you become a Liberty Scholar?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it helped to be brought up in Sweden in the 1970s when we really experimented with socialist ideas and having the government involved in everything, because that started a reaction that got me interested in ideas about how people could be free instead. And that led me to actually reading the classics, the classical liberals of the 19th century, the Manchester radicals, Adam Smith, Bastiat, and so on. And then that put me on a different path.
Yeah, well, that's good. So tell us, you being from Sweden, you can tell us, what exactly happened. When was there first reports of this coronavirus in Sweden in 2020? When was the first news? When was that first on the news?
Well, we heard a little bit about it very early in 2020, but that was something going on in China at the time. So we didn't think that much about it until it hit Italy in early 2020. And especially we have a spring break from Swedish schools in February most often. And lots of Swedes go to the Alps to ski, especially lots of families with kids. And actually, we did too. We were in the Austrian Alps at the time, right when the virus was most prevalent in Italy and in those areas. So some of us brought it back to Sweden, and that's when we really started to get worried about it.
Yeah, interesting. They don't ski on your own mountains. You go to the Italian Alps. I know I love watching the Olympics and all those beautiful Swedish skiers. But anyway, so that would have been what, February, middle of February? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So then when did it start getting, and so that gave it some more attention because you brought it back to Sweden, and there really, what was it also hitting Norway and hitting Finland and Denmark at the same time, or?
Actually, it came a little bit later to our neighboring countries. And one of the reasons is this particular spring break, which is not the same week in various in different countries, but it's not even the same week throughout Sweden. So in the second and third biggest cities, they had their spring break earlier when there wasn't much of a virus in Italy or elsewhere. So only Stockholm was there right at the moment when it took off dramatically. And that's one reason why Sweden got it before, actually Stockholm, our capital, got it before our other cities got it and before our neighboring countries got it as well, too.
But isn't Stockholm about half the population?
Something like it. I mean, it's Greater Stockholm. It's 2 million people.
Okay,
10
well,
million.
maybe not 2 million, but definitely it's definitely the largest city, and really I don't know if there are any the international hub and I don't know what the second largest city really compares to Stockholm, but yes, okay. So anyway, so then what happened after that? It was just, when did people start acting scared or curtailing their activities, or did people ever do that, or would they just go about their business?
Well, this was the moment when it started to spread throughout Europe, and Americans got scared too. And that's when lots of countries began to lock down, imitating China and imitating Italy. And there was lots of pressure on Swedish authorities and the Swedish government to do the same thing. But they held out, saying that, look, we've game planned pandemics before. Our public health authorities have done so. So has the World Health Organization. And nowhere in those plans did we say that we should lock down entire societies, shut down businesses, close down schools. So let's not throw out the manual. We don't know much, and that's a reason not to wreck more things. But instead, what happened then was that Swedish authorities began to recommend people to be socially distant, work from home, avoid public transportation if they could. But there was no mandatory guidelines, no police, no surveillance drones looking at people to make sure they weren't out jogging or anything like that.
Yeah. So did people really change their activities that much, or did they pretty much keep things the same way? I mean,
well, it depends on your what you compare it to, because obviously Sweden had a very different pandemic because we didn't shut down in this way.
yes.
So foreign journalists were in Sweden shocked at seeing children go to school, parents going to work, and restaurants being open. But at the same time, there was, and you can see that if you look at mobility data from telecom companies, that we saw a rapid reduction in things like going on public transportation, going to the traditional crowded places, shopping centers, and so on in Sweden as well, but on a voluntary basis, because people, if they could avoid going out, they often did.
Yeah, and of course, you had of course the airlines, a lot of. I remember somebody showed me a picture of all the canceled flights, especially because Sweden was still, because you could still go if you could leave your own country, you could still go to Sweden. I mean, Sweden was still pretty much open to foreigners, right?
Yeah, and lots of people just got here to experience normality in a way. What happened, though, is the Swedish authorities wanted to keep the borders open, and Anders Tegnell, who was the famous guy at the public health authorities, who was sort of the public face of the Swedish model, said that border closures and lockdowns, there's no basis for this in science. It's absolutely crazy. On the other hand, once the European Union shut its borders to the rest of the world, Sweden, as a member of the European Union, couldn't do anything but follow that example. So we had to shut our borders, despite not wanting to non-Europeans.
And of course, well, but did you have, for example, a lot of Norwegians just coming over there saying, "Okay, I'll leave Norway for a few months and go here where it's normal"?
Many wanted to, but the Norwegian authorities weren't very happy about that. So they actually at times blocked the borders and stopped Norwegians from coming to Sweden. And if they got through the borders, and traditionally Nordic countries are open borders in between one another. But even Norwegians who have summer homes on the Swedish west coast weren't allowed to go there because of the Norwegian authorities. And if they managed to cross the borders anyway, they weren't led back home. So there were problems.
Yeah, that's another problem. We've had this situation literally where people weren't let back in. So interesting. So Sweden, so for example, even though it might not touch it, you couldn't fly from New York City to Stockholm, even though the flight wouldn't stop anywhere else.
Right. Yeah. Once the European Union stopped it, you couldn't. I had my own experience of this. I think I must have been one of the last European who entered the United States. And I got to my hotel room and I looked at cable news, and there was President Trump saying, "We don't want any more Europeans." So by midnight, I'm shutting down all air traffic over the Atlantic. So I had actually some problems getting back home because, some airlines shut down the routes immediately. It took me 3 different bookings to even get on a plane to Iceland. I thought that's as close as I get, and then in the worst case, I'll take a boat or something.
That had to cost you a lot of money too, didn't it? Or did you get your money back or not?
Luckily, I did this for a production company doing a documentary, so they lost some money, but we got some of it back.
I'm surprised. You know what's funny is I'm surprised we did not see more airlines go out of business during all this, but I don't think we saw any airlines go out of business. It was kind of shocking. If there probably were, but if there were, I didn't see it because airlines are always going out of business because it's just a tough business to be in. But yeah, so
yeah, you would think.
Did anybody in the airline industry speak out against this? I mean, Michael O'Leary of Ryanair seems like the kind of guy who would have said something about it if anybody.
Yeah, he's a real contrarian, but I don't know if he did. And for some time there was this total panic. It was almost impossible to challenge any of the rules and regulations and border closures. So it might have been that not even he could do that.
Yeah, I'm assuming that Finns or Swedes probably, go on the ground to Norway and Finland. Where do they usually fly to when they fly?
Swedes?
Yeah.
No, we want to go south to have some sun and warmth and some summer time. So usually, during this time, spring, summer, lots of Swedes would normally go to Italy, to Spain, Portugal, and countries like that. But it was a long staycation instead.
Yes, of course. Well, every place on Earth gets the same amount of sunlight and dark over the course of 1 year, but it does. But it's not always balanced out. Was it still pretty cold in Sweden when all this went down?
Yeah, at least you don't want to sit outdoors.
Yeah, what's a typical February in Sweden, in Stockholm, like usually? I mean,
it's still winter time. It could still be snowing, so it's below minus in degrees in Celsius. So it's you'd think it's very, very cold in February.
Yeah. So so the policy things just stayed normal. When did you first see signs that you all had done the right thing, or that Sweden had done the right thing?
That's a good question. Swedes on the whole were supportive of these policies, even though there was a lot of nervousness. When the whole world does something and you're the odd man out, it feels kind of awkward. But at the same time, there was always public support for these policies. And unlike many other countries, there was increased support for the public health authorities, for the government, and so on. So there was always this sense that this is probably the right way to go about things, especially when we saw some of the harshest restrictions in other places. I think that's when we really started to think that we are the lucky ones. We're allowed to still meet our friends and our relatives, and if we need to go somewhere, we can do it. So from an early point in time, we thought it was a good policy, but we didn't know the end result at that time. We didn't know if this would come at a terrible price. We knew some things, that this is probably much better for the economy. This is probably much better for school children, not being away from school for months or a year or what have you. But we still had no idea where this would end up when it comes to health, when it comes to mortality. And that took quite a long time to work out.
I believe that Latvia also stayed pretty much open. Is that correct, or do you know?
I am not in a position to speak on that. And not in the way Sweden was, at least, but it could be that in comparison to other countries.
Well, that's also a country that's fairly easy for Swedes to travel to as well.
Yeah, it's close by.
Just go across, just take a boat across, if nothing else. Yeah. I've tried to get a Latvian on here to talk about other things also, mainly, but I haven't really found a good Latvian yet. I also want to get a Latvian perspective on the war, but So things pretty much, you didn't really have this economic disruption, but Sweden is hardly an island. So you still probably had some economic disruption just because it was disrupted everywhere else.
Oh, sure, definitely. And
I mean,
Sweden is a small country, incredibly dependent on trade and on exports to other countries. So the moment we see a drop in consumer confidence
yeah.
in the rest of the world, it hurts.
Is that mostly with Norway and Finland, or who else? Who else is a big trading partner for Sweden?
Europe mostly,
Okay.
Germany, the Netherlands, and so on. But so some with the rest of the world, America and China and so on. So obviously there was some tremendous difficulties when it comes to exports, but the economy did hold up quite impressively compared to other places. You know, the world economy, if you compare the projections before the pandemics, the forecasts with the end results after 2021, the world economy was 2.9% smaller than forecasts had expected.
Yes.
The US economy was, I think, 1.2% smaller. The Swedish economy was actually 0.4% bigger than the forecasts had it
I
before the pandemic. So, despite all the difficulties, it seems like Sweden held up quite well.
Yeah, and I think for all the awful things that can be said about these policies, it brought to a quick end what was probably the best decade in the history of the world economically. I
Yeah,
mean, especially for the poorest of the poor. Uh,
yeah. And I think that we've never seen a stronger example of the benefits of open markets, of open trade and global capitalism. The fact that the moment we shut it down, the moment we grounded the flights, blocked the borders, interrupted trade, we saw this collapse in the world economy. We saw an increase in extreme poverty that had previously been reduced faster than ever in world history. Suddenly we saw an increase by probably some 70 million people in 1 year. That's what happens when you interrupt global capitalism.
yeah, and there really isn't much extreme poverty in Sweden, is there? I mean, not compared to say places in Africa or
No, no,
Asia.
no.
I mean, and yeah. So, and Swedes don't really fly within Sweden, do they? Or I mean, if they fly, they mostly fly outside of Sweden. Is that right, or is that wrong?
Well, there are some business and family relations
Yeah,
so that we keep on going. It's
it's a
there are a
long
few of
game.
us, but it's a very long country, so we do need our domestic flights as well. But yeah, mostly when we go to the trouble, we want to go somewhere else.
But hardly anybody lives up that far north like that either, I suppose. I mean,
No, that's right. And that's an interesting point when people say, look, you don't have much of a population density in Sweden. Well, we do because in two-thirds
well,
of the country, it's almost empty.
yeah, and living. I said about. I suppose most of the people probably live around Stockholm or south, or the entire part south of Stockholm.
Yeah,
As you go further north, there just isn't anything there because it gets cold up there. It's yeah.
that's right. Yeah, agriculture is difficult up there.
Yeah. So what kind of numbers did you see by the end of the year for Sweden?
You know, we had these models produced by scholars and government agencies in various places where they try to look at so how many people would die, kind of models that shocked voters and politicians and panic. It got them to panic and lock down their countries. And we had models saying that some 30 to 70,000 Swedes would die from COVID by the summer of 2020. And that never happened. It was around 5,000 people. So according to some of those models, just 7% of what the models had projected. And that tells you something that we shouldn't pay too much attention to some of that modeling going on. And that meant that it was, as a share of the population, we're better off than Southern Europe, than Britain, than the US, but it still meant that we were worse off than our neighboring countries, than our Nordic neighbors in Norway and Denmark and Finland. And that's the time when lots of people around the world said we were a disastrous failure in Sweden, and that we have willingly sacrificed people's lives. On the other hand, Swedish public health authorities said that, there's not really a way of stopping this transmission until we have a very highly efficient vaccine. So other countries are bound to catch up with Sweden eventually. And I guess that's what we are seeing in the data now.
Well, another thing too is you didn't have a situation in Sweden of people missing mammograms or missing colonoscopies or missing missing checkups for various diseases that weren't considered critical. And obviously also elective surgeries were still taking place in Sweden. Which is where, at least in America, that's where hospitals make a lot of their money, is on these elective surgeries.
Yeah. This broader point is incredibly important. The moment you focus all your attention and all your efforts and energy on one single problem, no matter what kind of problem this is, then you fail to see that there's always a cost-benefit analysis. Sure, if we all stay at home, we won't get a particular virus, perhaps as soon as we'd get it, but we lose out on other health preventions. We're going to see more mental illness issues. We're bound to see more domestic abuse, loneliness, suicide. More workers hurting, more school children hurting, and so on. And that's why you need this broader perspective rather than just being obsessed with particular problems at any one time.
And while it might not be completely effective, there are certainly people who say that I have to go to my Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
Yeah.
Because if I don't go, I fall off the wagon, as we say in America. That was one of the first things I thought of when this happened. What are they going to do? And one thing you got to admire about those people, they do not cancel meetings for anything. They will meet on Christmas. They will meet on holidays. They will meet. We got to have a meeting. And that's, sometimes just the action, of having that repetitive activity and going to a meeting once a week is what keeps you on. But we saw a lot of that. I know of, hearing stories of kids committing suicide. It's not really been, a positive thing at all. So that was another thing. Were there any reliable numbers on that, or did anybody see those numbers? Deaths caused by the policies?
I've tried in my Cato report to look at the publicly available data sources that we have. And, scholars are still trying to find good data, and it's always difficult to find internationally comparable data, and especially this early after the pandemic. But we did see a few things. We've seen things like the increase in domestic abuse in most countries with lockdowns, whereas in Sweden, it seems like it actually declined. We've seen reviews of suicide, that an increasing trend in the number of suicides in most countries, at least. In Sweden, there was actually a small decrease in the first 2 years of the pandemic. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on those things. And I hope that many researchers are doing their job right now.
Yeah, many researchers. I don't know what to say. And can we ever really measure the costs of the policies? Because something might not have gotten invented, or something, because of the lost productivity as well. But you didn't have a case, where you were throwing food away and having the supply chain disruption like you had it elsewhere.
Yeah, some things we'll never know. Sure, of course, yeah.
What do you, what do you think motivated Sweden? Do you think there was something Sweden just wanted to be contrarian, or what do you think? Because with all the pressures coming in,
Yeah.
what motivated them to resist the pressures here? Because it seemed like they must have been tremendous. And I've even heard, of countries. Well, also Belarus. Yeah, we don't want to forget about Belarus. Not really embracing any of this at all. In fact, probably being even more open than Sweden. But I heard at least in his case that he was actually bribed to implement some of these policies. Was there any attempts by any? I can't remember. Is the International Monetary Fund who tried to bribe Belarus or something, just saying, "Hey, destroy your economy, we'll give you this money"? Was there anything like that, or what made Sweden say no to all this?
Well, it's not that we want to be contrarian. On
Yeah.
the contrary, Swedes want to be very normal
Oh
people and
yes.
highly respected around the world. We want to blend in. But what happened was really that Swedes started to ask,
Yes.
so it's not why are we doing this? Why are you doing something else? Because this wasn't in the manual. We never discussed locking down entire societies to this
Yeah.
extent. It was this sense that other countries hadn't done a proper analysis of this. They hadn't thought things through. They panicked and began to imitate China and its brutal lockdown. And for some people, for some Swedes in the government agencies and so on, it became this almost a matter of honor of following the science rather than
Yes.
politicizing the issue. And that was, of course, highly controversial internationally. This is the moment in time when everyone said that it's a disaster. New York Times was saying that Sweden is the world's cautionary tale. Donald Trump said that Sweden is suffering greatly because it suffers tremendously because it doesn't lock down. So there was lots of pressure to do something in Sweden, but I think that one interesting reason why this happened is that traditionally Swedish government agencies are somewhat less politicized than they are in the US and other European countries. The boss of every government agency, like the public health authority, is appointed by the government, but he sits on a fixed mandate. It isn't thrown out and there's a new guy appointed by the next government. So instead, they are seen as more independent. They're supposed to follow the law and follow the facts rather than a particular political agenda. And this liberates them a little bit into giving non-politicized advice to governments. And I think, and this is my suspicion, I think this also liberates Swedish politicians because, politicians in so many other countries, they just had to be seen to be doing something, whatever it is, the politician's logic, something has to be done. This is something, therefore it must be done. Whereas in Sweden, they could say that, look, I'm not an expert. I don't know epidemiology, but these guys at the public health agency in Sweden, they do. And they've given me the advice not to lock down, not to shut Sweden down. And my suspicion then is that they knew that if they failed tremendously, they could blame the public health agency and say that we do what we traditionally do in Sweden. We follow the advice rather than second guessing them. And if that would have turned out to be a disaster, I think they could have blamed the civil servants instead.
Yeah, and I do have to ask too. What would you say is the overall health condition overall in Sweden? I mean, health is not very. Americans are not very healthy at all. I mean, we've actually got a declining life expectancy going back to 2014 now. I mean, would you say Swedes are overall healthier? I mean, because for most people who died during this, COVID was not the only factor. It was one factor, but it wasn't the only one.
Yeah. Well, I would say, and I hope nobody's offended, but I think Swedes are healthier than Americans
Yes.
Overall. And I mean, we tend to walk and take the bicycle more often. And perhaps there's also a bit healthier food and stuff like that. So life expectancy hasn't declined in the same way in Sweden. There are fewer health conditions that would make people more susceptible to a new virus, for example. And I definitely think that's a factor. It's not just COVID. It's also quite often something more else besides.
There's definitely more of a walking culture in Europe. And, another thing too, not just a walking culture, but I also see more of a culture of going up and down the steps.
Yeah.
And I think, going up and down the steps is, if, doing that for, 100 yards is probably more effective exercise than, just walking for maybe 300 or 400 yards. I don't know. I don't know exact numbers, but definitely, there's definitely more exercise in going up and down the steps than not going up and down steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's
And
true.
the other thing too is Sweden, as far as I know, doesn't really have a large pharmaceutical lobby. I don't know if any of these European, if I spoke, what European countries would, but America certainly has its large pharmaceutical lobby.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had major pharmaceutical companies, but they've often moved out. Astra was Swedish. It's now AstraZeneca. We had other drug firms that have been bought up. So that's right. We're not doing that much more nowadays,
Yes, well,
which we're quite sad about. They were helped out quite a lot with research and good, decent jobs in Sweden. So it was a sad day for Swedes when they left.
Well, you still have IKEA. You gave us IKEA, and I'll always be grateful for Sweden for giving us some really great music.
Yeah, IKEA and ABBA. We're proud of them.
Yeah, not just ABBA, Europe, Roxette. There's a few others, but yes,
Oh, yeah.
definitely more than you would expect from a country of that size.
Yeah,
but everybody there pretty much speaks English, don't they?
that's right. We do that from an early age, and one thing that sets Sweden apart from most European countries is that we do tend to watch American and British movies and TV series in the original English, and then they're subtitled. So instead of sort of having a German James Bond speaking dubbed into German, it means that children listen to English from a very young age, and they can then read the subtitles and get the translation instantly. So that's one reason. The other reason is there are a few of us. We're 10 million. If we want to speak to somebody interesting, we need to learn English.
Yeah, that also can apparently have a very good impact on teaching kids to read, is having them watch things with subtitles. Even if it's in the same language, I definitely would encourage kids to watch when they're at that age to watch it with the subtitles. They'll make the connections. It's amazing how that works. So what happened with Sweden? So were there any local policies? Like, did Stockholm have its own policies or anything like that, or was it pretty much just wide open? Because sometimes it seems like the cities were a little crazier than the more rural areas.
Yeah, no, there wasn't much of that, and one reason is that local authorities do not have that much power in Sweden to bring out sort of major lockdowns or anything like that. It has to be a parliamentary decision and to give the government that power, basically. So we didn't see that. We did have some restrictions on the national level. We had things like, you couldn't stand and drink in a bar or a restaurant. It had to be table seating, and there had to be distance between the tables. There was a ban in April 2020 against visiting nursing homes for the elderly to try to reduce transmission of the virus. And most restrictively, there was a ban on public events of more than 50 people. And for a period of time, this was even lowered to 8 people. So public events, it means, you couldn't have a concert, you couldn't have a lecture, you couldn't have
hockey game,
which is very painful for a Swede not to go to the hockey game.
yes,
You could have private events. You could have sort of private parties. This didn't include shopping centers or offices or anything like that. But public events were restricted during this period. But apart from that, workplaces, public transportation, offices, factories, schools, hairdressers, gyms were open.
yes. No hockey games. Yeah. So yeah. That's one thing I've noticed. The Swedes play hockey, but the Norwegians don't. It's kind of interesting. But, oh well, they must have their reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, they can't all be the same, but yeah.
They all do cross-country skiing instead, so and beat us there.
And of course, alpine skiing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever. So what happened when the vaccines came out in Sweden? When did they come out, and what happened with that?
Well, it's kind of the same story all over the place. It's not very different from the US. It was rolled out fairly quickly at first to most vulnerable groups. That was the idea the whole time. Try to keep society open, but protect the elderly and those who are really vulnerable to the virus. And fairly quickly, people got their shots, and that's when society could start to open up again, even though, again, that the difference wasn't as stark as it was in many other countries that had really locked down.
Yeah. So was anybody really coerced to get the vaccine, or was it pretty much all voluntary?
It wasn't a voluntary process, but there were still some restrictions in place where it said that you can avoid these restrictions for this kind of public event if people are vaccinated. Then we can begin to open up in those areas. So it wasn't coercive to that extent, but there was a strong push to get it, because then you'd get back some of those liberties that had been taken from you.
Is that still the policy, or did that eventually go away?
That went away, and traditionally Swedes are also very sort of willing to take their vaccines. And interestingly, one reason is that it's never been coerced in Sweden, so it has never been politicized to the extent. I mean, you have many vaccines are mandatory in a country like Italy, and people don't like vaccines and they don't trust the authorities. So actually, people try to get around it. Whereas in Sweden, it's an offer, and then Swedes want to get it.
Yes, I want to go on record that the day after my 12th birthday, I was bit by a dog. We never found him. Would I go get the rabies shots again? Yes, I would. So
that makes sense.
Yes, that was a long tested vaccine, and it's not nearly as bad as you think it is. But it's 100% fatal if you get it. So, but yes,
don't take the risk.
Yeah. So anyway, Sweden has a lot of compliance, or there was some, maybe 90%, or how'd that work out?
Actually, I don't have the exact numbers here, but yes,
it also seems like the numbers went down as more boosters came out. I mean, when it was one shot, everybody said yes, but it's like it's
not everyone got 5.
How many shots are you going to ask me to get here? It's
but compared to other countries, Sweden has a very high percentage who got the vaccine and got it early as well.
It was 7 when I got the rabies shots. I heard it went down to 5 pretty soon. This was in the 1980s. This was a while ago. Yeah. But yeah, so they had a schedule for it. It was all planned out. Yeah, so that was so Sweden. So now it looks like, personally, I think my attitude toward it was always just let it rip if it has to, because it doesn't impact other things. where do you think, when did it really look like the numbers, caught up for Sweden? I mean, Sweden was better off in Norway, and I assume, by the way, that the demographics of Norway are pretty much the same, right? I mean, you've also got to consider, whether or not you have an older population or a younger population and things like that.
Yeah, there are so many different factors and variables that you're really going to have to look at when you adjust the numbers, and this will keep scholars busy for years. I mean, it's different in age structure, it's a difference in population density. Sweden also has more refugee immigrants, the lower education, also more crowded households, partly as a result of that, and that has an effect as well. So there are so many different things to look at. But if you look at the overall picture, what happened was that, yes, during the first wave, lots of people said that, look, Sweden is a failure. But then during the second wave and next year, other countries began to catch up to Sweden, and some surpassed us, even in sort of COVID deaths, even though that's a tricky it's a tricky definition because it varies between countries a little bit. But that's when you saw that Sweden was definitely an outlier when it came to policy, but not when it comes to mortality, and actually much lower than Southern Europe, Britain, the United States, and eventually what the Norwegian state epidemiologist said quite recently. It seemed like the Swedish public health authorities were right when they said that others would catch up, because now, after 3 years of the pandemic, we all end up in a fairly similar place. And that's why it's important to look at not just how you define COVID, because some people who were registered as dying of COVID actually died with COVID, but the cause was something else. It's important to look at overall death, overall mortality. And that's why so many researchers said we're going to have to wait for numbers on excess deaths, the number of deaths in a country above a previous period or a previous trend. And that's one of the things I'm looking at in the paper. And the thing that really astonished me is that when you just look at crude excess deaths, and this hasn't been adjusted for anything. This is just the 3 years of the pandemic compared to the 3 previous years. Then Sweden has the lowest excess mortality of all European countries, even lower than Norway, Denmark, and Finland. And it's less than half of America's excess death rate. And then you're going to have to adjust it for lots of factors, and depends on which ones and the period you compare it to. And according to some ways of doing this, Denmark beats us to first place. According to some other methodologies, Norway beats us. But no matter how you do it, no matter how you slice the data, Sweden has one of the lowest excess death rates of all rich countries, and less than half of what the United States had.
Yeah. One of the worst cases of false reporting in America was in Colorado, where they reported it as a COVID death, and the person had a blood alcohol level of 0.54, which before 2020 would have been ruled alcohol poisoning. I mean, it was so far over the limit to kill you. It's just, that was one example. But you come up with these examples, but it's interesting how I think a lot of times you can just make up numbers all the time if you want to make them up. It's what country in Europe was probably was the worst? Did you look at which country was the worst place to be? I mean, for all these restrictions. I mean, I've maybe heard Belgium but
yeah, well, the country with the harshest restrictions, that's difficult because they came in so many different shapes and forms, and some of them were more temporary and some were more permanent. I think one of the best places to be was the Nordic countries generally, not just Sweden, but also our neighboring countries, because they had shorter periods of lockdowns than others, whereas Southern Europe and Italy and Spain and France were much more restrictive over a longer period of time. And that, of course, is incredibly interesting when you look at the data on COVID deaths and excess mortality, because the Nordic countries did better than all of the other places.
Yeah, certainly. It sounds like it was definitely something that really worked out well for them. I think we pretty much covered COVID. I don't know if you mind if we go into a few other Sweden topics.
Sure, we Swedes
how are
love
the
Russian.
Swedes reacting to the skirmish right now with Russia and Ukraine?
We're very worried because we're close to Russia,
Yeah,
and it's traditionally we've had quite a few invasions and attacks and attempts to for espionage and sabotage from that area. So it kind of woke us up to the reality that the Poles and the Baltic states were right all along when we thought they were being paranoid and saying that, the Russians are going to come back sooner or later. This time it was sooner. So this is worrying, and most Swedes think of it as not just Ukraine's fight, but also our fight, because if a major power like Russia thinks that it can move and change borders in Europe through massive industrial scale violence, then nobody is safe. And it's incredibly important that Russia fails in its ambition, not just for Russia's and Europe's future, but I think it would also send a terrible message to countries like China if they learned that this is the way to go about things, and they might make a success of it. So Swedes are supporting Ukraine with whatever we've got.
Finland has always had a policy of basically everybody's the militia. Why doesn't Sweden have a policy like that? Although Sweden hasn't been involved in a war officially since when?
Since 1812, basically, that's the
Yeah,
last
the
time around.
Napoleon era. Yeah.
Yeah, and one reason is that we were, quite heavily beaten by Russia in 1809, and they took the eastern part of country from us, Finland.
Yes.
Luckily, they got their independence later on. But that kind of changed the mentality in Sweden. We shouldn't try to be a big power and be everywhere and have a powerful military, but instead, as one of our great poets called it, win Finland back within Sweden's borders. In other words, try to nourish the economy and technology and innovation and culture so that we recreate all that wealth we once had, but within a smaller region. And since then, Swedes have tried to basically stayed out of the heat, even though we're always quite happy when democracy is sort of ally against a greater foe.
And you can always jump on a boxcar and start handing out passports.
That's plan B. Yeah.
The great, no doubt, the greatest Swede of all time, Wallenberg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of the legacy that we're
Yeah.
proud of. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But Sweden really doesn't have a lot of much in common culturally with Finland, though. People don't realize that, especially the language differences.
Yeah, this is quite surprising to lots of people. In Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, it's almost the same language. It's just like different dialects. And even Icelandic is the old way of speaking Scandinavian that we all spoke 1,000 years ago. But Finland it's completely different language. It's Finnish-Ugrian. It's a relative of Estonian and
Yes.
Hungarian
Yes.
rather than anything else. On the other hand, most Finns speak Swedish because they learn it at school, since it used to be one and the same country. Just 200 years ago, there's still some of that culture left, but language poses a barrier. Quite.
Yeah, because they're just not close. They're just not close at all. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't understand a word.
Yeah, yeah. I sometimes wonder if do you think maybe we'll get to a point where those three languages kind of fuse and it just becomes one language? Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, or something like that. If the languages survive at all, though, really, I think that's another question too, though, with everybody speaking English.
Yeah, it could be that, or it could even be that with modern translation technology, we can all speak our own language, but listen to it in a Star Trek Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of way. And in that case, I guess those languages will remain separate, but we will all understand one
Yeah.
another.
I find it interesting that Sweden has there's such a large Swedish Wikipedia for such a small country. And, I mean, there must be
Oh,
a lot of Swedes putting a lot of articles up there.
oh, is that the case? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah.
that's really, I see that as a measure of what I'd call language pride. People, they want to keep their language alive, and they see this as a way to do it. So we'll put as many Wikipedia, we'll write a Wikipedia page in our language and keep it up. Maybe it's a
Yeah.
competition. So it's a very interesting thing. So yeah, so where do you think? What do you think the prospects are for Sweden of maybe not being the? It's often been the poster child for democratic socialism. Do you think Sweden will go capitalist, or do you think it'll just kind of stay where it is?
I think we already have to quite a large extent. You know, when American leftists, a Bernie Sanders or an AOC, says that we want socialism, and no, we're not thinking of the Soviet Union or Cuba, we're thinking of Sweden. Well, then I've got news for you. If you want to be like Sweden, you, as an American politician, you would have to impose things like social security reform, including partial privatization,
Yeah,
deregulate lots of markets, more free trade, almost no occupational licensing. You would have to introduce a national school voucher system and give private schools the same kind of funding, abolish taxes on inheritance, on property. Actually, America would have to lower its corporate tax rate to get to where Sweden is, and generally have open up many product markets to even more open trade. So Sweden has come a long way since the 1970s and 1980s and gone back to an earlier model, the one that made Sweden rich originally, which
yeah,
was a very limited government, very open, free markets. Uh, that made us incredibly rich in the late 1960s and staying out of two world wars. But we
yeah,
got so rich that politicians thought that they could do anything. Let's just redistribute money and increase public consumption tremendously. They doubled the size of the government in just 20 years. And this was the sort of the 20, 25 years when we really experimented with socialist ideas. But it ended, and it ended in a collapse, in an incredible economic failure, because we didn't create a single net job in the private sector over that period. Many of our most important companies left for other places. Yes, IKEA is Swedish, but actually the foundation owning it left Sweden for tax purposes. So
yeah,
did Tetra Pak and many of our greatest entrepreneurs. And it all ended in a great financial crash in the early 1990s. And since then, Sweden has reformed quite a lot. Not as much as I would prefer, but at least so much that we're now more of a normal Western country rather than a socialist outlier.
and Sweden still uses the krona, correct? They're not using the euro, right?
No, we had a referendum, but we wanted to keep the krona. It worked well for us.
Yeah, I think also maybe because it's a smaller country, you're just more represented. I mean, what does a member of parliament how many people does a member of parliament represent? Maybe 10,000 or 20,000. It's not. I mean, in America, it's almost getting to the point where it's well over 500,000.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a major difference, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've also heard too that while Sweden even was high tax, it was always a lot of the Scandinavian countries are still they were high tax, but they were still very low regulation. And
Yeah.
maybe it's the high regulation that what makes things worse because you just have to please these bureaucrats and deal with all this arbitrary stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look at international comparisons on economic freedom and free markets, the Fraser Institute report, for example, then you see that Sweden and the Nordic countries, yes, we have a bigger government, we have a more generous welfare state and higher taxes. But when it comes to economic freedoms in other areas, competition, free trade, deregulation, and so on, Sweden, the Nordic countries generally, are much more free than most Western countries. And that's a reason why it's possible to afford all the other things that are quite costly, because there are quite successful multinational competitive businesses that bring in the money.
Well, that's good. Yeah. So, yeah. So where do you think Sweden's going to be in 20 years? Do you think it's, I mean, one people talk about, in a lot of European countries, it's just they're not gaining population. Nobody's having kids.
Yeah, that's right. This is a worry to me. I've never believed in the idea that we would all suffer from overpopulation. I think we need people. There's a good case for people, because yes, we consume resources and we use space, but we also create and invent. We come up with solutions to all sorts of problems, including environmental problems, and we come up with new resources. So if we're all suddenly we're all below replacement level, and populations are going to start to shrink eventually in throughout Europe, at least, and eventually in Sweden as well. This is a worry. I worry that we might become less inventive, less entrepreneurial, less good at creating decent, dynamic societies. So what I hope is that we'll move quickly to more of AI that helps us
Yes.
being creative and come up with new ideas and combinations of old ideas, and more robots. We need more robots and automation, not just in industry, but in the service sectors, in retail, in transportation. We're going to need it in our home to do the dishes and the laundry and take care of us as well, because nobody else will when our population declines.
I'm I'm about ready to wrap this up, but I got to ask, what would you do if you had 2 or 3 hours with Greta? How would you make her a capitalist?
Um, that's a good question. I think that I would try to walk her through the kind of places, the kind of countries that have been successful in reducing carbon dioxide emissions, because there are some. There are 40 to 50 countries that have managed to grow their economies and reduce carbon dioxide emissions in recent years. And which countries are those? Well, Greta says that she doesn't believe in fairy tales about economic growth and technological innovation. That's not what's going to solve the problems. But incidentally, those 40, 50 countries are the sort of the richest countries, the most innovative, the most entrepreneurial, free market oriented countries. They are the ones who've invested in better technologies, in reducing the energy intensity of their economy, digitizing everything and making sure that it's ones and zeros rather than lots of heavy manufacturing and heavy pollution. So it's really, it's capitalism is not just a fairy tale. It's a good story. I try to tell her that, I think.
I think Sweden has been. Sometimes I think when you have to fight against this harsh weather and this harsh conditions, it just makes you tougher. And maybe that's something that all the Nordic countries have. It's like being in the hot tropics all the time makes you soft, but when you have to go there and fight this, fight this cold and all that stuff, maybe it makes the people tougher.
We would like to think so. That, yeah, we at least you have to sort of plan a little bit in advance and think more long term, because you're going to
Yeah.
freeze to death and the crops will all rot, or they won't grow. So there's probably something to that argument. On the other hand, if it's warm enough, you're going to have to do something to stay alive and get the air condition to work anyway. So there might be something for that argument too.
Well, Johan, it's been great having you. Do you have a website, right? JohanNorberg.com, and
.net, N-E-T,
.net.
yeah.
That's
But
the
it's
.net
not very
English.
well updated, but if you Google me, you'll find
find your stuff there. Yes, and you're at the Cato website. It's been great talking to you. I've not been to any of the Nordic countries, but that's Sweden and Finland are probably higher on my list. I'd like to maybe go see them. Definitely want to go in the summer where I have more sunlight. Or
do that in summertime. It won't be pitch dark, and people will be very happy compared to how you'd find them in the midst of winter.
How many hours of day does Stockholm get on the solstice?
Well, it's actually difficult to find some dark in the middle of summer, just a few hours.
Okay.
But it also means that there's just a few hours of light.
Yes, exactly.
In the middle of winter.
It's half and half for everybody, no matter where you are, but sometimes it can really get skewed.
Yeah, that's right. But on average, we do well.
Yeah, well, Europe is further north generally than the USA is generally. It's all higher up. I mean, yeah. Well, it's been great having you on here, and I certainly hope we can. I don't believe I've met you, so hopefully we can maybe meet up sometime. It's good to talk about Sweden. Everything's back to normal. You can certainly travel and get into the country without any issues. I was just in England, Ireland, and Spain, and it was all pretty much normal. So I'm glad to see that. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely we woke up from the nightmare.
Well, please like the video, subscribe, follow the channel, thumbs up. Go buy my novel, Escape from the Village, and check out my Substack. This is Chris Baker, and we're out. Yes.